It was a warm, quiet evening in the small suburban town of Maplewood, the kind of evening where the sun casts long golden shadows across neatly trimmed lawns and the air smells faintly of freshly cut grass. James Carter, a man known for his sharp suits and sharper mind, walked down the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets. He wasn't in a hurry. He rarely was. As the director of the FBI, he had learned patience over decades of service. Tonight, however, he wasn't dressed in his usual formal attire. Instead, he wore a casual pair of jeans and a simple blue polo shirt. It was part of an undercover operation that had just wrapped up. James was a tall man with broad shoulders and a commanding presence. His salt and pepper hair gave him an air of authority, but his eyes, kind yet piercing, were what people noticed most about him. They were the eyes of someone who had seen too much yet still believed in doing what was right. Tonight, though, those eyes carried a hint of fatigue. Undercover work took its toll, even on someone as seasoned as James. As he approached his car parked along the curb, two figures emerged from around the corner. They were young police officers barely out of their academy training. Mark, the taller of the two, had short blonde hair and a stern expression. His partner Ryan had darker features and a nervous energy that made him seem restless. Both wore uniforms that were crisp and clean, badges gleaming under the streetlights. To anyone else, they might have looked like protectors of the peace. But tonight they weren't acting like it. Mark and Ryan had been patrolling the area when they spotted James walking alone. At first glance, there was nothing unusual about him. He was just another man heading home after a long day. But something about him caught their attention, or rather several things. First, he was black, which immediately raised red flags in their minds. Second, he seemed too polished for this neighborhood, according to Ryan. And third, he wasn't driving a fancy car or carrying anything expensive. That combination made them suspicious. "Hey, you!" Mark called out, his voice loud enough to startle James. The two officers quickened their pace, closing the distance between them and the unsuspecting man. When James turned to face them, his expression remained calm, almost curious. He'd dealt with situations like this before, both personally and professionally. He knew how quickly misunderstandings could spiral out of control, especially when racial bias came into play. "What's going on, officers?" James asked politely, his tone steady and measured. "We're checking IDs tonight," Mark replied gruffly, pulling out his notepad. "Can I see yours?" James nodded and reached into his pocket without hesitation. He handed over his driver's license, watching as the officers scrutinized it carefully. Their eyes darted back and forth between the card and the man standing in front of them. Something didn't add up, for them anyway. "This says your name is James Carter," Ryan said, frowning slightly. "And you live here?" "Yes," James answered simply. "Is there a problem?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Instead, the officers exchanged glances, silently agreeing to dig deeper. "What are you doing out here at this time?" Mark pressed, his tone more accusatory now. "I live nearby," James explained, patiently. "I was taking a walk. Is there some issue I should be aware of?" Ryan stepped forward, crossing his arms. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood," he remarked bluntly. The comment stung, though James didn't let it show. He'd heard variations of that phrase countless times throughout his life. Each time it reminded him of the invisible barrier society often placed on people based solely on the color of their skin. "I assure you, I do belong here," James said firmly. "If you'll excuse me, I'd like to get home." He held out his hand for his ID, expecting the matter to end there. But instead of returning it, Mark tucked the license into his pocket and gestured toward their patrol car. "Sorry, sir," Mark said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "We're going to need you to come with us." "For what?" James asked, his voice rising slightly. "On what grounds are you detaining me?" "Suspicious behavior," Ryan chimed in, shrugging as if it were obvious. "Just cooperate." "Okay, it'll go easier for you." James felt a surge of frustration but forced himself to stay composed. Arguing wouldn't help. Experience had taught him that much. Reluctantly, he allowed them to lead him to the cruiser. As they cuffed his wrists and pushed him into the back seat, he couldn't help but notice the irony. Here he was, A man whose entire career revolved around justice, being treated like a criminal because of the assumptions others made about him. The ride to the station was tense and silent. James stared out the window, his thoughts racing. He knew how dangerous these situations could become, especially for black men. Every headline, every news report flashed through his mind. Yet despite the fear gnawing at the edges of his consciousness, he refused to let it consume him. He focused instead on finding a way to resolve this calmly and effectively. Meanwhile, Mark and Ryan congratulated themselves on making such a big catch. In their minds, they were heroes protecting their community. They joked about how easy it had been to spot troublemakers, completely oblivious to the gravity of their actions. Back at the precinct, James was led into a holding cell while the officers processed paperwork. One by one, other detainees stared curiously at the sharply dressed man now sharing their space. To them, he seemed out of place, not because of his race, but because of his demeanor. A young woman named Lisa whispered, "That guy doesn't look like he belongs here." Her observation went unnoticed by the guards, but it planted seeds of doubt among those watching silently. Upstairs, Mark and Ryan proudly reported their arrest to their sergeant, boasting about how they'd taken down someone suspicious. When Mike asked why exactly they'd detained him, they stumbled over vague answers about acting weird and not fitting in. The sergeant frowned, sensing something off but deciding not to press further, at least not yet. Little did anyone realize, however, that James's phone call request would soon turn everything upside down. For James, sitting in that cold, dimly lit cell felt surreal. He'd spent years fighting for fairness and equality, only to find himself on the wrong side of the system he served. Yet even in the darkest moments, he never lost sight of hope. Because deep down he knew this wasn't just about him. It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly, profiled or dismissed because of prejudice. And as he waited for the opportunity to make his next move, he vowed to use this experience to spark change, not just for himself but for everyone. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh glow over the sterile walls of the police station. James sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell, his hands resting loosely in his lap. Despite the cuffs that had been removed, upon arrival he still felt their weight, both physically and emotionally. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. As someone who dedicated his life to upholding justice, being locked away like a criminal was a bitter pill to swallow. Yet, instead of anger or despair, James felt an eerie calm settle over him. He knew better than to let emotions cloud his judgment. From the corner of his eye, he observed the other detainees. There was Lisa, the young woman who had earlier whispered about how out of place he seemed. She couldn't have been older than 25, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Across from her sat an older man with graying hair and weary eyes, muttering under his breath about unpaid parking tickets. Then there was a teenager slumped against the wall, headphones dangling around his neck, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. Each person carried their own story, their own struggles, but none of them looked at James with hostility. Instead, they regarded him with quiet curiosity. It was as if they could sense that he didn't belong here, not because of his race, but because of the way he carried himself. Even in handcuffs, James exuded dignity. Meanwhile, upstairs, Mark and Ryan were basking in what they believed was a job well done. They strutted into the sergeant's office, their chests puffed out like peacocks displaying their feathers. "We got one tonight," Mark announced proudly, tossing the paperwork onto the desk. The sergeant, a grizzled veteran named Tom Harris, glanced up from his coffee cup with mild interest. His salt and pepper beard and weathered face hinted at years of experience, but also weariness. "What do you mean we got one?" Tom asked, leaning back in his chair. His tone was neutral, though his sharp eyes missed nothing. "This guy," Ryan chimed in, unable to contain his excitement. "James Carter. We caught him acting all suspicious near Elm Street, totally out of place." Tom frowned, picking up the arrest report. "Suspicious how? What exactly did he do?" Mark hesitated for a moment before answering. "Well, he was just walking around. Didn't look like he belonged there. And we found this," Ryan added, pulling James's driver's license from his pocket and sliding it across the desk. Tom studied the ID carefully, his brow furrowing deeper with each passing second. Something about the name sounded familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. "Did you run his info through the system?" Tom asked, setting the license down. "No need," Mark replied confidently. "It's pretty obvious he's up to something. Just look at him." Tom sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. He'd seen this kind of reckless behavior before. Officers jumping to conclusions based on gut feelings rather than evidence. It rarely ended well. Still, he decided not to challenge them directly, at least not yet. "All right, fine, put him in holding until morning, we'll sort it out then." Relieved that their superior hadn't questioned them further, Mark and Ryan grinned at each other. They returned to their desks, replaying the night's events in their heads. To them, arresting James felt like a victory, a triumph over some faceless threat lurking in their community. What they failed to realize, however, was that their actions were rooted in something far more insidious: implicit bias. Back in the holding cell, James finally spoke up. "Can I make a phone call?" he asked the duty officer stationed nearby. The man shrugged indifferently and handed him a receiver connected to the wall. James dialed a number from memory, his fingers steady despite the circumstances. On the other end, his assistant picked up almost immediately. "Hello?" came the voice on the line. "It's me," James said calmly. "Get me the Attorney General. Now." The assistant hesitated for only a fraction of a second before responding. "Yes, sir, right away." Within minutes, high-ranking officials within the federal government were alerted to the situation. Panic rippled through the chain of command as news spread. The FBI director had been unlawfully detained by local police. Agents scrambled to locate James while lawyers prepared statements condemning the incident. For law enforcement agencies, nationwide, this was shaping up to be a public relations nightmare. Downstairs, Mark and Ryan remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing above them. They joked about their big bust, trading playful jabs about who deserved more credit for spotting James first. Their laughter echoed through the otherwise quiet precinct, drawing annoyed glances from coworkers trying to focus on their tasks. None of them realized that their carelessness would soon come crashing down on them. Upstairs, Sergeant Tom Harris was about to receive the shock of his career. A frantic knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Before he could respond, a junior officer burst in, his face pale and sweaty. "Sir, we've got a problem," the officer stammered, clutching a piece of paper. "That guy we arrested earlier, it's James Carter, the FBI director." For a moment, Tom froze, his mind struggling to process the information. Then, like a dam-breaking, realization hit him full force. "What?" he barked, rising sharply from his chair. His voice carried through the room, silencing everyone nearby. Officers exchanged uneasy glances as whispers began to circulate. Had they really arrested the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Tom stormed out of his office, heading straight for Mark and Ryan's desks. By now, word had reached them too, and their smug expressions had vanished, replaced by sheer terror. "Is this true?" Tom demanded, slamming the arrest report onto the table. Both men stared at him wide-eyed, unable to form coherent sentences. We didn't know," Mark stammered, his voice trembling. "He didn't say anything." Tom shook his head in disbelief. "You two are unbelievable. Do you even understand what you've done?" He didn't wait for an answer. Spinning on his heel, he marched toward the holding area, determined to fix the mess before it spiraled further out of control. By the time Tom arrived, federal agents were already swarming the precinct. Dressed in dark suits and armed with credentials, they moved with precision, taking charge of the situation. Cameras flashed outside as reporters gathered, eager to capture every detail of the unfolding drama. Inside, chaos reigned supreme. Officers scrambled to explain themselves while higher-ups frantically called for damage control. James emerged from the holding cell flanked by two agents, his expression unreadable. His tailored suit jacket, brought by one of his colleagues, hung neatly over his arm, a stark contrast to the casual clothes he'd worn earlier. Reporters shouted questions as he made his way to the exit, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about him. It was about exposing the flaws in a system that allowed such injustices to occur. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit his face, offering a brief reprieve from the tension inside. James paused for a moment, gazing at the crowd gathered beyond the barricades. Among them stood Lisa, the young woman from the holding cell. She held a sign that read, "Justice for all." Her eyes filled with determination. For a fleeting second their gazes met, and James nodded almost imperceptibly. In that moment he realized that this ordeal, painful as it was, might serve a greater purpose. The next few hours passed in a blur. Statements were issued, apologies offered, though they rang hollow, and investigations launched. Mark and Ryan were suspended pending review, their careers hanging by a thread. Meanwhile, James retreated to his home, where he spent the rest of the night reflecting on what had transpired. He knew the fight for equality and accountability was far from over, but tonight, he'd taken the first step toward meaningful change, and, so as dawn broke over Maplewood, casting light on the shadows of the previous evening, James Carter prepared to turn this personal injustice into a catalyst for reform. The fallout from James Carter's arrest spread like wildfire. By morning, the story dominated headlines across the country. News outlets ran sensationalized reports with titles like "FBI Director Wrongfully Arrested by Rookie Cops" and "Systemic Racism Exposed in Shocking Police Blunder." Social media exploded with reactions, ranging from outrage to disbelief. Videos of the arrest leaked online, showing grainy footage of James being handcuffed and shoved into the patrol car. The clips went viral within hours, sparking heated debates about racial profiling and police misconduct. For Mark and Ryan, the two officers responsible for the arrest, the day began with a mixture of dread and denial. They had arrived at the precinct early, hoping to avoid attention, but it was impossible. Their colleagues avoided eye contact or muttered under their breath as they passed by. Some openly blamed them for bringing shame to the department, while others defended their actions, claiming they were just doing their job. Neither response brought comfort. When Sergeant Tom Harris called them into his office, both men braced themselves for the worst. "You two are in serious trouble," Tom said bluntly, his voice heavy with frustration. He tossed a stack of papers onto the desk, printouts of news articles, angry tweets, and official complaints filed overnight. "Do you have any idea what you've done? This isn't just a local issue anymore, it's national news." Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. We didn't know who he was, sir," he stammered. "If we'd known—" "That's exactly the problem," Tom interrupted, slamming his fist on the table. "You shouldn't need to know someone's title or position to treat them fairly. You profiled him because of how he looked, not because of anything he did. That's discrimination, plain and simple." Ryan hung his head, unable to meet Tom's gaze. "We thought we were protecting the community. And instead you embarrassed this entire department," Tom shot back. "Suspensions are already being processed. Depending on the investigation, you could lose your badges, and rightly so." As the weight of their actions sank in, Mark and Ryan exchanged guilty glances. For the first time, they began to understand the magnitude of their mistake. But understanding came too late. Outside the office, federal investigators were combing through every detail of the incident, interviewing witnesses and reviewing body cam footage. Meanwhile, higher-ups scrambled to contain the damage, issuing public apologies and promising reforms. Yet no amount of spin could erase the fact that one of the nation's top law enforcement officials had been treated like a criminal, all because of bias. While the police department grappled with the scandal, James Carter found himself at the center of a media frenzy. Reporters camped outside his home, desperate for a statement. Calls flooded his phone from politicians, activists, and concerned citizens alike. Everyone wanted to hear his side of the story, but James remained silent, for now. Instead, he spent the morning reflecting on the events of the previous night. Sitting in his study, surrounded by books on history and civil rights, he replayed each moment in his mind. He thought about the fear he'd felt when the officers approached him, the indignity of being cuffed and locked away, and the quiet solidarity of the other detainees. Most of all, he thought about Lisa, the young woman whose whispered observation had hinted at doubt even among those trapped in the system. Her words stayed with him. That guy doesn't look like he belongs here. To James, it wasn't just a comment. It was proof that people could recognize injustice even in its subtlest forms. By midday, James decided it was time to address the situation publicly. He called a press conference inviting journalists and community leaders to gather at FBI headquarters. As cameras rolled and microphones clicked on, James stepped up to the podium, his presence commanding immediate silence. Dressed in a crisp, navy blue suit, he exuded authority yet warmth, a balance he'd mastered over years of leadership. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady and clear. "What happened last night was not an isolated incident. It is a symptom of a much larger issue, a pattern of systemic racism and implicit bias that continues to plague our society. I am fortunate to have the resources and platform to fight back, but for countless others there is no justice, no accountability, and no second chance." His words resonated deeply, striking a chord with everyone present. For many Black Americans, James's experience was painfully familiar. Stories of wrongful arrests, harassment, and mistreatment echoed through generations, often dismissed or ignored by those in power. But hearing it from someone like James, an esteemed figurehead of law enforcement, added undeniable credibility to the conversation. James continued, his tone growing more impassioned. "This cannot continue. We must hold ourselves accountable, not just as individuals but as institutions. Law enforcement exists to protect and serve, yet too often, it perpetuates harm instead. Training programs, diversity initiatives, and policy reforms are critical steps forward, but they mean nothing without genuine commitment to change." As he spoke, tears welled up in the eyes of some attendees. Others nodded vigorously, inspired by his call to action. When James concluded his remarks, the room erupted in applause. Journalists rushed to capture sound bites, while activists vowed to amplify his message. In that moment, James transformed from a victim of injustice into a powerful advocate for reform. The impact of James's speech rippled far beyond the walls of the FBI building. Across social media platforms, hashtags like #TrumpJustice for James Carter and #End Racial Profiling trended worldwide. Protesters gathered in cities nationwide, holding signs that read "Black Lives Matter" and "Equal Justice for All." Celebrities, politicians, and influencers joined the chorus, amplifying the demand for accountability. Even the president issued a statement condemning the arrest and pledging support for comprehensive policing reforms. Law enforcement agencies responded quickly, eager to distance themselves from the controversy. Departments across the country announced plans to implement stricter protocols, including mandatory bias training and increased oversight. In Maplewood, where the incident occurred, the police chief resigned amid mounting pressure. His replacement promised transparency and collaboration with community leaders to rebuild trust. For Mark and Ryan, life became unrecognizable. Suspended without pay, they faced daily scrutiny from neighbors and former colleagues. Friends stopped returning their calls and strangers glared at them whenever they ventured outside. Haunted by guilt and regret, they struggled to come to terms with their role in the debacle. At one point, Ryan confided in his wife, admitting, "I never meant for any of this to happen. I thought I was doing the right thing." But intentions didn't matter, not to the public and certainly not to those affected by similar injustices. What mattered was the outcome: a respected leader humiliated, a community outraged, and a national reckoning sparked by one careless decision. Amid the chaos, James received a letter that touched him deeply. It was from Lisa, the young woman from the holding cell. Enclosed with the note was a photograph of her holding the sign she'd made the night of his release. "Justice for all." Her words were simple, yet profound. "Dear Mr. Carter, thank you for inspiring me to speak up. Before meeting you, I didn't think my voice mattered. But seeing how you handled everything gave me hope. I want to dedicate my life to fighting for fairness just like you do. Please keep going. You're making a difference." James smiled softly as he read the letter. He pinned the photo to the bulletin board in his office, placing it next to awards and commendations earned throughout his career. To him, Lisa's message carried more weight than any trophy ever could. It reminded him why he had chosen this path in the first place, to create a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, could live without fear of prejudice. As the days turned into weeks, the dust slowly began to settle. Investigations continued, lawsuits were filed, and reforms took shape. For James, however, the work was far from over. He knew that real change required persistence, patience, and unwavering dedication. And though the road ahead would be long and challenging, he felt ready to face it, one step at a time. The weeks following James Carter's arrest transformed into a whirlwind of activity. While the media coverage began to wane, the ripple effects of the incident continued to shape conversations across the nation. For James, the experience became both a burden and a mission. He carried the weight of what had happened personally, but saw it as an opportunity to drive systemic change. His determination was unwavering, fueled by the countless stories he heard from people who reached out to share their own experiences of racial profiling and injustice. One morning, James sat in his office at FBI headquarters, sifting through letters and emails sent by ordinary citizens. Some expressed gratitude for speaking out. Others recounted painful memories of being stopped, searched, or detained without cause. One letter, written by a teenage boy named Marcus, stood out. "I'm scared every time I leave my house," Marcus wrote. "I don't know if I'll make it home safe because of how people see me." The raw honesty struck James deeply. It wasn't just about statistics or policies. It was about real lives impacted by prejudice. Determined to honor these voices, James launched a nationwide initiative called Justice Forward. The program aimed to address systemic racism within law enforcement while fostering dialogue between communities and police departments. Under its umbrella, workshops were organized, town hall meetings held, and partnerships formed with advocacy groups. At the heart of Justice Forward was a simple yet powerful idea. Change starts with listening. In Maplewood, where the arrest had taken place, tensions remained high. The local police department faced mounting pressure to overhaul its practices. Community leaders demanded transparency, calling for body cameras, independent review boards, and stricter accountability measures. Protesters gathered outside the precinct daily, chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and "Reform now." Among them was Lisa, the young woman from the holding cell. She had become a vocal advocate for reform, inspired by James's resilience and leadership. Lisa's transformation was remarkable. Once shy and reserved, she now stood confidently at rallies, microphone in hand, urging others to join the fight for equality. Her courage caught the attention of local activists who invited her to speak at events and participate in discussions with city officials. Though nervous at first, Lisa quickly found her voice, channeling her anger and frustration into action. "If we stay silent, nothing will ever change," she told a crowd during one particularly emotional speech. "We have to keep pushing until they hear us." Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Local news outlets featured her story, highlighting her journey from bystander to activist. When asked about her inspiration, Lisa credited James. "He showed me that even when things seem hopeless, you can still stand up and make a difference," she said. "That's what I'm trying to do now." For Mark and Ryan, life had become unbearable. Their suspension turned into termination after an internal investigation concluded they had acted recklessly and discriminatorily. Stripped of their badges, they struggled to find work in any capacity. Friends distanced themselves and family members grew weary of defending them. The once proud officers now spent their days avoiding public spaces, overwhelmed by shame and regret. Mark tried to rationalize his actions, telling himself it was just part of the job. But deep down, he knew better. Late at night, lying awake in bed, He replayed the arrest in his mind. He remembered the calmness in James's voice, the dignity he displayed despite the circumstances. It haunted him. How could he have been so blind? So wrong. Ryan, on the other hand, couldn't escape the guilt. He visited a therapist, hoping to process his emotions, but progress was slow. During one session, he admitted, "I thought I was protecting people. Now I realize I was hurting them instead." His therapist encouraged him to seek redemption by volunteering with organizations focused on criminal justice reform. Hesitant at first, Ryan eventually agreed. It was a small step, but it marked the beginning of a long road toward healing, for himself and perhaps for others. Back at the FBI, James poured his energy into expanding justice forward. He traveled extensively, meeting with mayors, police, chiefs, and community leaders to discuss strategies for reform. In each city, he shared his story, emphasizing the importance of empathy and accountability. His message resonated widely, earning praise from both allies and skeptics. Even critics who initially dismissed the initiative as too idealistic began to see its potential. One of James's most impactful stops was in Chicago, a city grappling with widespread distrust between residents and law enforcement. There, he partnered with grassroots organizations to host a series of workshops designed to bridge the gap. Officers participated alongside civilians, engaging in open dialogues about bias, privilege, and mutual respect. At first, tensions ran high. Some participants refused to look each other in the eye, but gradually walls began to crumble. During one workshop, an elderly black woman named Ruth stood up to address the group. Her voice trembled as she recounted being pulled over repeatedly throughout her life, often for no reason other than the color of her skin. "It makes you feel less than human," she said, tears streaming down her face. Across the room, a young, white officer named Kevin listened intently. When it was his turn to speak, he apologized not just to Ruth but to everyone in the room. "I don't want to be part of the problem anymore," he confessed. "I want to help fix it." Moments like these gave James hope. They reminded him that change, though difficult, was possible. Each apology, each act of understanding brought society one step closer to justice. As months passed, the impact of James's arrest extended beyond policing. Corporations, schools, and government agencies began examining their own practices, recognizing the prevalence of implicit bias in all areas of life. Diversity training programs proliferated, and discussions about equity entered mainstream discourse. For many, the incident served as a wake-up call, a reminder that progress required constant vigilance. James didn't rest on his laurels, however. He understood that true reform took time and effort. To ensure justice-forward sustainability, he worked tirelessly to secure funding and support from influential figures. Celebrities donated generously, while tech companies offered resources to develop tools for tracking police conduct. Grassroots movements embraced the initiative, adapting its principles to fit their unique needs. Through it all, James remained grounded. He never sought recognition or accolades. His focus was always on the bigger picture. Yet privately, he allowed himself moments of reflection. Sitting alone in his study late at night, he thought about the young boy who feared leaving his house, the elderly woman who felt dehumanized, and the rookie officers whose ignorance had caused so much harm. These stories weighed heavily on him, but they also strengthened his resolve. James knew the fight wasn't over. Racism and bias wouldn't disappear overnight. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Hopeful that the seeds of change were taking root. Hopeful that future generations might inherit a world where fairness and equality weren't just ideals, they were realities. And so, as autumn leaves fell and winter approached, James Carter pressed onward. With each step, he carried not only his own dreams but also the hopes of millions who believed in a brighter tomorrow. Months turned into a year since the night James Carter was wrongfully arrested. The memory of that evening still lingered in the minds of those involved, but its impact had grown far beyond what anyone could have anticipated. What began as a single incident of racial profiling had sparked a movement, a national reckoning with systemic racism and bias. For James, it wasn't just about personal vindication anymore. It was about leaving behind a legacy of change. By now, Justice Forward had become a household name. Its workshops, seminars, and community outreach programs reached every corner of the country, touching lives in ways James never imagined. From small towns to bustling cities, people came together to confront uncomfortable truths and work toward solutions. Police departments adopted new training protocols, schools implemented anti-bias curricula, and corporations pledged to diversify their leadership teams. It was slow, messy progress, but progress nonetheless. In Maplewood, the transformation was especially visible. Once divided by fear and mistrust, the town began healing through open dialogue and collaboration. Lisa played a pivotal role in this shift, organizing monthly forums where residents could voice concerns directly to law enforcement officials. At one such meeting, she stood beside the newly appointed police chief, a black woman named Angela Hayes, and addressed the crowd. "We're not here to point fingers," Lisa said firmly. "We're here to find common ground. Together we can build something better." Her words resonated deeply, earning applause from both civilians and officers alike. Angela nodded approvingly, adding, "Change starts with accountability, and I promise you, we will hold ourselves accountable." Under her leadership, the department introduced body cameras, civilian review boards, and stricter disciplinary measures for misconduct. These reforms didn't erase centuries of inequality overnight, but they marked significant steps forward. For Mark and Ryan, life remained challenging. Losing their jobs had been devastating enough, but the public scrutiny proved even harder to bear. Friends stopped inviting them to gatherings, and strangers recognized them on the street, hurling insults or glaring disapprovingly. Their families struggled too, bearing the brunt of the backlash. Yet, amidst the pain, there were glimmers of hope. Mark found solace in volunteering at a local youth center, mentoring teenagers caught up in the justice system. Many of these kids reminded him of himself at their age, eager but misguided. Through his interactions with them, he began to understand the harm caused by stereotypes and snap judgments. One afternoon, while playing basketball with a group of boys, he shared his story. "I made a terrible mistake," he admitted, "but I'm learning from it. I want to help you guys avoid making similar ones." The boys listened intently, surprised by his honesty. Afterward, one of them approached him shyly. "Do you think people can really change?" the boy asked. "Yes," Mark replied without hesitation. "But it takes effort. You have to be willing to face your mistakes and grow from them." Ryan, meanwhile, immersed himself in advocacy work, joining organizations focused on criminal justice reform. He attended rallies, distributed educational materials, and spoke candidly about his past misdeeds. Though some dismissed him as insincere, others welcomed his participation, recognizing the value of redemption. "If someone like me can learn and evolve," Ryan often said during speeches, "then anyone can." Despite their efforts, neither man expected forgiveness anytime soon. They understood that trust once broken took years to rebuild, if it ever did. Still, they clung to the belief that their actions, however flawed, could contribute to a larger cause. Back at the FBI, James continued leading with quiet determination. His arrest had left an indelible mark on him, shaping how he viewed his role as director. No longer content to simply enforce laws, he sought to challenge the systems that perpetuated injustice. He worked tirelessly to ensure Justice Forward remained a cornerstone of the Bureau's mission, embedding its principles into every level of operation. One evening, as he prepared to leave the office, James received an unexpected visitor. It was Lisa. She hesitated briefly before stepping inside, clutching a folder filled with papers. "Mr. Carter," she began nervously, I wanted to thank you again. For everything." James smiled warmly, gesturing for her to sit. "You don't need to thank me, Lisa. You've done more than enough already." She shook her head. "No, you inspired me to step up. Because of you, I decided to go back to school. I'm studying criminal justice now. I want to make a difference, just like you do." She handed him the folder, which contained her application essay for a prestigious scholarship program. In it, she described her journey from feeling powerless to becoming an advocate for reform. James skimmed the pages, his eyes misting over. "This is incredible, Lisa. Truly. I have no doubt you'll achieve great things." Her face lit up with gratitude. "It's because of people like you that I believe change is possible. So, thank you." As she left, James sat quietly for a moment reflecting on her words. Lisa's determination reminded him why he kept fighting despite the odds. Change wasn't achieved by one person alone. It was a collective effort, fueled by countless acts of courage and resilience. The following spring, James delivered a keynote address at a national conference on policing reform. Hundreds of youth attendees packed the auditorium, eager to hear from the man who had turned a personal tragedy into a catalyst for progress. As he stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. James waited patiently for the noise to subside before beginning his speech. "Tonight, I stand before you not as a victim, but as a witness to the power of perseverance," he said, his voice steady and commanding. "What happened to me was unjust, yes, but it also opened my eyes to the broader struggles faced by marginalized communities. It forced me to confront uncomfortable truths and to act on them." He went on to outline the successes of Justice Forward, highlighting stories of reconciliation and growth. He spoke of Ruth, the elderly woman who forgave the officer who wronged her, Kevin, the young cop striving to break cycles of prejudice, and Lisa, the once shy detainee now blazing trails in advocacy. Each story underscored a simple yet profound message. Change was possible when people chose empathy over fear. As James concluded his remarks, he paused, scanning the audience. "Let us remember," he said softly, "that justice isn't a destination. It's a journey, one we must walk together. Let us continue to listen, to learn, and to lead with compassion. Only then can we create a future worthy of our children." B&I. Standing ovation lasted several minutes, but James barely noticed. His mind was elsewhere, envisioning a world where fairness and equality weren't exceptions, they were norms. Years later, historians would look back on this period as a turning point in America's ongoing struggle for civil rights. Textbooks highlighted James Carter's arrest not as a scandal, but as a moment of awakening, a reminder of how far society had come and how much farther it needed to go. Statues of influential figures included Lisa's likeness alongside James's, symbolizing the power of grassroots activism. For James, the legacy of that fateful night extended beyond policies and programs. It lived in the hearts of those who dared to dream of a better world, and in the actions of those who worked tirelessly to build it. As he retired from the FBI, passing the torch to a new generation of leaders, he felt a deep sense there of fulfillment. Standing on the porch of his home one evening watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and pink, James allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. He thought about the young boy who feared leaving his house, the rookie officers who regretted their actions within 6 minutes, and the millions of others touched by the movement he helped ignite. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, James knew one thing for sure: the seeds of justice once planted would continue to grow for generations to come.